My name is David Davis from TrainSignal, and this is the top 10 new features of Windows 2012 Hyper-V. I really appreciate everyone joining us today, and we've got a lot of attendees, and so I'm looking forward to talking about Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V, and then I'm going to make sure I save plenty of time towards the end for questions. So save your questions towards the end, or feel free to ask them during the webinar, and I'll be answering them primarily at the end of the webinar. All right, so with that, let's get started. Again, my name is David Davis, and I've been at TrainSignal for over 5 years now, and in the IT industry for 18, maybe 20 years now. I don't know. It's been a long time. In that time, I've served in numerous positions: server admin, network admin, Unix admin, IT manager. Primarily, I got most of my experience at a medium-sized company. We had about 2,500 employees, about 80 locations across 4 states here in the U.S. And I worked at the corporate office, managed the data center, and really all of the IT resources for the company. So it was a great learning experience for me. I was able to move up the ranks, starting even as low as just the backup operator while I was in college there, all the way up to the IT manager. And I just learned so much, and I really appreciate the experience. And during that time, that was when I got my first taste of virtualization. We implemented virtualization in production. Back then, there was no Microsoft Hyper-V. We started with Microsoft Virtual Server. We moved to VMware Server and later to VMware ESX. And those servers are still running strong. So in my spare time, I wrote a lot of different articles, a lot of white papers and blog posts for various websites, including Virtualization Review, Virtualization Admin, Computer World, the Petri IT Knowledge Base. I've spoken at a number of conferences, including VMworld 3 times now, and also created over 15 different video training courses for TrainSignal. And most recently, the 2 courses I did were Windows Server 2012 HyperV Essentials and HyperV New Features. And that's where actually I gained, of course, all my experience on this relatively new virtualization product, or at least the latest incarnation of it, Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V. So I've also obtained a number of certifications you see at the bottom there, and I think my greatest aspect here is just my passion about virtualization and cloud computing. It's just a topic I really love and enjoy talking about. And for those who know me from all my VMware courses out there, you might be asking yourself, hey, aren't you a VMware guy? Why are you here talking about Microsoft today? And I'm not going to sit here and say, I've converted. I'm only a Microsoft guy now. I'm not a VMware guy anymore. VMware's bad. No, I'm more of a virtualization guy and a cloud computing guy is how I like to label myself. And it's just that passion about virtualization and cloud computing. It's my goal to learn all I can about the different virtualization hypervisors out there and cloud solutions to ensure that I can explain them to you in TrainSignal courses and blog posts and webinars like this, as best I can. With Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V, there are a ton of new features. They have across-the-board improvements over Windows Server 2008 R2 Hyper-V, and Microsoft breaks these new features down into these 8 different categories, and I'll be breaking the features down into these same categories just because they match up with how Microsoft, categorized them. I think it's a good category system, and what I'll try to do instead of trying to pick, just 10 features out of Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V, because there's there's more than 50. There's many features, many features. I'm going to first explain all the different features in kind of the shotgun approach. I'm going to throw it all out there at you. Hopefully some of those features you find interesting and fascinating for you and for your environment. Hopefully some of them stick and you see those as being very valuable. And then in the end, I'll come back and I'll give you my top 10, Hyper-V 2012 features. So without further ado, we'll be just kind of quickly moving through all these different features. And, along the way, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the question box, and I'll do my best to answer those questions at the end. So starting with secure multi-tenancy. really what Microsoft did is, these multi-tenancy features were added to make Hyper-V 2012, a more a hypervisor that's really capable of creating a private or public cloud. And Microsoft Hyper-V needed these types of features, such as the extensible virtual switch, private VLAN capability, the programmatic interface into the network layer. It needed these types of features to be able to create a private cloud at the service provider layer. I doubt many enterprises will be using, private VLANs, day one. It's not the top feature on the list for most enterprises, unless you're a service provider or an extremely large enterprise. But for most, Hyper-V admins, they'll appreciate those features later one day when they do go to create a private or public cloud, or if, maybe they take advantage of those types of features through their service provider. But for the typical Hyper-V admin, I think one of the coolest features out of this category is the extensible virtual switch, because now you can get third-party tools that will be able to talk to the network layer and learn about the network layer and tell you what's happening on the network layer inside the Hyper-V virtual network, who's talking to who. The Hyper-V router guard and DHCP guard are also, welcome features. What these do is if a rogue DHCP or router pops up on the virtual infrastructure, it will prevent those types of broadcasts from going across, the rest of the virtual network and the physical network. So let's say you're building a lab environment, you're testing, DHCP, you've got a Windows server with DHCP enabled as a virtual machine, but you also have a production DHCP server, out on the physical infrastructure. The Hyper-V DHCP guard will prevent those DHCP broadcasts from coming through that virtual machine out onto, the rest of the network. Same thing for router, the router guard feature. So that's the secure multi-tenancy. Generally not a lot of excitement there for the typical Hyper-V admin, but to me I get much more excited when I start talking about all these flexible infrastructure features, inside this category. So when you get into flexible infrastructure, this is where we start talking about the live storage migration feature, which to me is a huge plus. So with live storage migration, you can move the storage of a running virtual machine from one storage location to another. So what that means is, say you need to shut down, some shared storage, you can easily move those virtual machines to maybe local storage on the Hyper-V host, shut down that shared storage, perform some maintenance, and then bring it back up. Or maybe you're going to replace some shared storage. You can move those running virtual machines, virtual disks to that new storage and then, shut down the old storage. So it's going to create a lot more uptime and give, many more, just a lot more flexibility, to the Hyper-V admin. The live migration enhancements, the wizard interface is much improved. It makes it much easier for the Hyper-V admin to, perform either live migrations, meaning moving the running virtual machine, not its storage, most likely, but just the running virtual machine's memory from one host to another, or to move, the storage of a virtual machine from one host to the other and leave the virtual machine, where it is. Now, the combination of those two is what you've probably heard about, which is the shared nothing, migration. So you can perform a shared nothing live migration where you move both the storage and the memory of a running virtual machine from one host to the other. Some other features here, that are important are the snapshot merging. Snapshots are much faster, and Hyper-V has the ability to merge snapshots. When you delete, let's say, a snapshot, it can merge the snapshots. Simplified virtual machine import virtual machines, much easier. Improved PowerShell commands. The IP address rewrite and generic route encapsulation, those are typically for larger infrastructures, typically for service providers. And simplified VLAN management, of course, is welcome as well. Moving on to scale performance and density. This is something that Microsoft, of course, has touted significantly, and that's the increased scalability of Windows Server 2012. So with Windows Server 2012, you can have up to 320 logical processors per host and up to 4 terabytes of memory per host. So that's a lot of resources for a single physical server, to be able to wield and share with, the virtual machines running inside. Also, in terms of virtual machine scalability, you can have up to 64 virtual processors and up to 1 terabyte of memory per virtual machine. So that's a massive virtual machine. As VMware calls it, monster virtual machines. You get into that sort of scale. Now, that's not the typical virtual machine that most admins are creating out there. You just don't need a VM that size, but it's nice to know that your hypervisor can scale to that ability. Some other enhancements in terms of scalability are up to 64 nodes per cluster. So when you create a failover cluster, you can have up to 64 Hyper-V hosts in the cluster and up to 8,000 virtual machines in a single Hyper-V cluster. So some really amazing scalability. And then NUMA. NUMA support is included inside the virtual machine. So not something that the typical VMware, there's a first flub up where I call the VMware instead of Microsoft. Not something the typical Microsoft Hyper-V admin needs, but the thing about NUMA is that it's enabled by default, and so by default, Hyper-V does the right thing related to NUMA. So you really don't have to think about NUMA. I can give you some great links to try to help you understand NUMA and wrap your head around it, but again, it's not something you typically have to think about. But the scalability is impressive. Moving on, some more benefits related to scale and density. SRIOV, or single root IO virtualization, similar to VMware's direct path. With single root IOV, you can dedicate hardware so that it's not going through the virtual layers, so that a virtual machine is talking directly to hardware, say like a SAN HBA. The dynamic memory reclaim and threshold values. So dynamic memory in itself is not new, but the reclaim and threshold values that you can set are very cool. Smart paging, the runtime memory reconfiguration, those are all related to dynamic memory. Resource metering, this is something that they really needed for a private cloud as well. So the ability for Hyper-V to monitor the resources being consumed by each of the virtual machines and then report on those. That's something that there's even some third-party tools out there that are able to report on those resource utilizations for each virtual machine, but it's also something, of course, that System Center needed access to. And definitely, if you're a cloud provider, you need to know what types of resources the virtual machines are consuming. The new VHDX, or virtual machine hard disk format, has been expanded. So now those virtual machine hard disks can scale up to 64 terabytes in size per virtual machine. So that's a massive virtual hard disk. And there's some other capabilities inside there as well. For example, support for the 4 kilobyte disk sectors, improving performance across the board and scale of the virtual machine disk files. Offload data transfer, so for storage that supports what they call ODX, offload data transfer, you can actually have storage perform storage operations for you. For example, moving a virtual machine. Data center bridging, or the DCB, is something that's used in converged data centers, typically for large-scale fiber channel SAN implementations. And let's see, virtual fiber channel. So a virtual machine can connect directly to a fiber channel SAN. And then quality of service minimum bandwidth settings. You can set quality of service on each of your virtual machines. And then finally, high availability. Incremental virtual machine, virtual disk backup, asynchronous replication of virtual machine changes, NIC teaming, load balancing and failover protection, failover clustering. Failover clustering has been tremendously improved since the last version. You've got increased scale, simplified live migration from for your virtual machines. It can all be administered from the failover cluster interface. Support for Hyper-V, Replica, search, filtering, custom views inside failover cluster manager. The cluster validation tests, I really like that feature. It goes through and tells you if you've really done everything right in the configuration of your failover cluster. The virtual machine affinity and anti-affinity rules to keep virtual machines together on a single host or to keep them apart, on different hosts. Application monitoring, inside the applications running on the virtual machines that are being clustered. So a lot of new features related to high availability. And then these are some of the details from Microsoft on the difference between Windows Server 2008 R2 and Windows Server 2012. So these are the, by the numbers, as they like to say. comparisons between the two. So you can see there's been a lot of upgrades between, the logical processors, of a physical server that are supported went up from 64 up to 320. Physical memory went up from 1 terabyte to 4 terabyte. Virtual processors per host, virtual processors per virtual machine from 4 up to 64. Memory per virtual machine went from 64 gigs to 1 terabyte. Active virtual machines now up to 1024. I'm not going to read through every one of these, but you get the point. There's a lot of scalability enhancements related to processor and memory. There's networking enhancements. NIC teaming, is now built in. VLAN tagging, ARP spoof protection, MAC spoof protection, SRIOV, network QoS, network metering, network monitoring. All these features are now included. Storage enhancements, a number of storage enhancements, live storage migration. They say that there's no limit to the number of concurrent, live migrations that can occur at one time. Of course, the competitors are taking some exception to that. But there isn't a specific number that's given. It's really just based on the limitations of your hardware, according to Microsoft. Virtual machines now being able to be stored on SMB storage, I think, is a great benefit for SMBs out there, so that they don't have to purchase a shared storage array of some kind. So they could use a file server. They could create a file server cluster. Really, they can do whatever they need to do with a Windows Server license in terms of providing shared storage that they might need for their HyperV failover cluster. Guest fiber channel, the new VHDX, virtual disk format of 64 terabytes, virtual machine guest clustering, many more features, available in storage. And then manageability, new HyperV PowerShell commandlets are available, network PowerShell, storage PowerShell, a lot of manageability improvements as well in Windows Server 2012 HyperV. So I just threw out a lot of features there, just about all the features that are available in HyperV Server 2012. And now you might be wondering, the title of this webinar was my top 10 new features. So now let's get a little bit more into what the new features are and what my favorites are of those new features. So starting with number one, and I don't know that actually all of these are brand new. Some of them, they've just been improved. Let me throw out that caveat there. So first one is the installation of HyperV. To me, this is just coming from an SMB side, a small business, medium-sized business. My biggest pain point was any application that required an expert consultant to come in and install it. And with HyperV, it's really just, if you know how to install Windows Server, you can install HyperV, because it's just adding a role, just like you add any other role on your Windows Server 2012 system. You can add the HyperV role. So really, I like it that any Windows admin can install HyperV. It doesn't take a professional consultant to do it. Now, if you're, of course, creating a large enterprise virtual infrastructure with HyperV, you may want some professional consulting help there. But just getting HyperV going, it's just so super easy. The scalability is another thing that I really like. The massive scalability that Windows Server 2012 HyperV offers is just really impressive. I went to TechEd 2012 last year, and you can actually go out on the web on Microsoft's Channel 9, and you can watch the same presentations I watched on HyperV. Microsoft's Jeff Woolsey did an impressive job demonstrating, the scalability of Windows Server 2012 HyperV, as well as all these, other features. So I think that's something that, Microsoft is bringing to the table to compete with the other hypervisors out there, is these massive scalability improvements. Number three is shared nothing migration. So you can move a running virtual machines, memory, and storage from one host to another with no shared storage in between. With VMware, which I'm traditionally used to using, shared storage is just kind of a requirement. If you want to do a vMotion, you want to use distributed resource scheduler or high availability, any of the advanced features, you need shared storage. So when Microsoft said they were releasing shared nothing migration, that was kind of, I think, a wow for all the other virtualization admins out there, who said, wow, we always had to have shared storage, and now you don't need shared storage. That's really impressive. Now, since then, of course, VMware with vSphere 5.1, they have released enhancements to vMotion so that it does a storage vMotion and a regular vMotion at the same time, effectively giving you the same results as a shared nothing migration. But shared nothing migration, is included in just even the free version of HyperV Server 2012. So that's still, pretty darn cool. Live migration and storage migration. We talked about, I just mentioned shared nothing migration, but I really like the wizard enhancements to live migration and storage migration. The question and answer interface here, it walks you through the wizard-driven interface to move a virtual machine. It just makes it really easy. If you just read the question and select the right answer, pretty much you can perform a live migration or a storage migration. It doesn't take a rocket scientist with a lot of experience to do this. The extensible virtual switch is actually something that I've tested and had some hands-on experience with as well. Coming from a network background, being a CCIE, I really always want to know what's going on the network. I guess that's just ingrained in me. And with HyperV in the past, it was kind of hard, really with any virtualization platform initially. It was very hard. There weren't a lot of tools. Pretty much you had to put a traffic sniffer, let's say, inside a virtual machine, and then turn on a promiscuous, mode for that virtual machine and try to gather traffic and see what was happening. Then you would almost have to do that on every hypervisor, every host that you had, every HyperV host, to try to gather information and see what was really happening. And it made it just difficult to really find out what was going on in the virtual network. So if you need to troubleshoot a problem, you need to monitor bandwidth and just ensure that nothing bad is really happening, or find out maybe why were backups running so slow last night, or why was your web server running so slow. Well, let's check the network. Now with the extensible virtual switch, HyperV Server 2012 gives you at least the option or the hook to be able to do this. Now you still need some other tool. For example, the tool you see on the screen there is from a company called Five9. And they have some tools that utilize the extensible virtual switch to, you can monitor the network, you can implement a virtual firewall, so you can create rules to and from your virtual machines or to and from the outside network. They also have, inline antivirus scanning of the virtual machine disk files to ensure, no malicious attacks are happening. So they utilize this extensible virtual switch, and there's other companies out there. I can give you a list of them. For example, Cisco has their new Nexus 1000B virtual switch that can be used with HyperV, and that's utilizing the extensible virtual switch. There's other network monitoring tools out there to monitor the traffic overall across, the HyperV virtual network and really see what's going on. So to me, coming from a network background and being a virtualization guy, I really want tools to tell me what's going on the virtual network. And now with Windows Server 2012 HyperV, at least we have that option with the extensible virtual switch. Another feature that I really like is Replica, replication of virtual machines, from host to host for disaster recovery, data protection purposes, totally included with Windows Server 2012 HyperV. And so finally, really everyone can afford replication. It's built in with Windows Server Hyper-V for you to be able to replicate individual virtual machines across a WAN link or across, let's say, a secure VPN tunnel from site to site. It's totally included, and it's surprisingly easy to use. There isn't a lot to enable or configure or download or install. It works with any application, any virtual machine. And that's something, again, coming from, the SMB side of, technology, small and medium-sized businesses, now they can finally afford, replication. And at the end of this, if we have time, I'll go into my lab environment and just show you some of these things. I want to make sure I get through all the features and, answer questions as well. But Replica, again, one of the cool features of Windows Server 2012. Dynamic memory. So with dynamic memory, what you can do is you can get a greater, virtual machine to host ratio. So what that means is you can get more virtual machines on your host thanks to dynamic memory. So previously, let's say, just to use some simple math, you had a HyperV host that had 16 gigs of RAM, and you assigned 4 gigs of RAM to each of your virtual machines. Well, 4 times 4 would be 16. So you had about 4 virtual machines you could put on that host if you assigned each one of them 4 gigs of RAM. With dynamic memory, you can, this can kind of be a gray area here. So I can say, I want to enable dynamic memory on my virtual machine, and then I want to give that virtual machine a minimum amount of RAM of 512. So it at least needs that just to keep running. At the startup, I might give it 4 gigs still, but if it needs up to 10 gigs, I could give it up to 10 gigs. But for the most part, I think this virtual machine is really not going to use that much memory, and it's going to sit more down around 1 meg or 512 megs or 1 gig when it's pretty idle. And so if you think about that, if most of your virtual machines on average are sitting around 1 gig of memory utilization, when previously you were assigning them 4 gigs, well, you just saved a tremendous amount of memory on that HyperV host, and because of that, you can add many more virtual machines. So that's what dynamic memory does in effect. And these what's new in Windows Server 2012 are the minimum and maximum memory, the memory buffer configuration, and the memory weight. So memory weight is how to prioritize the availability of memory for this virtual machine compared to other virtual machines. So maybe if you have a print server, the memory weight is low. If you have a important web application, the memory weight is high. Now, dynamic memory does require a specific operating systems, really relatively new Windows operating systems, and you have to enable this before you power on the virtual machine. You can't enable dynamic memory after the virtual machine's already powered on. Number 8 on my list are the failover clustering enhancements. It's much easier to create a failover cluster. You get the increased scalability that we talked about, support for Replica. The cluster validation testing is very nice to make it so much easier to create a HyperV cluster. The memory-aware placement is nice as well. So if a virtual machine has to be restarted, it will be restarted on a host that has available memory to run that virtual machine. So failover clustering enhancements, very nice, easy to use. You no longer need a quorum disk, which is nice. Number 9 on the list is free HyperV Server 2012. Really, all the features of Windows Server 2012 HyperV Standard are available at no cost for free in free HyperV Server 2012. Now, of course, the downside is there's no local graphical operating system. So you install it, you don't get your nice, pretty Windows GUI with the nice Windows 8, Windows Server 2012 tile interface. But, if it's just being used as a HyperV server, you can run HyperV Manager on your local desktop, and you can still manage that free HyperV server and still take advantage of all these features. So to me, it's a small price to pay. I mean, most of the time, once I have a HyperV server or a Windows Server 2012 HyperV host up and running, I'm not going to the console very much anyway. I don't typically RDP to it. I'm using HyperV Manager remotely anyway. So free HyperV Server 2012, if you have a low budget, it's a great way to get started with virtualization and still be able to take advantage of all these features we talked about, like live migration and storage migration and Replica. And then number 10 is storing virtual machines on FMV3 file shares. So you don't anymore, you no longer need shared storage to take advantage of some of these advanced features we talked about. So you could use a dedicated Windows file server with SMB3, or you could create a file server cluster with a couple Windows file servers, in a cluster configuration, and store all your virtual machines on those. So no need to buy some dedicated hardware. Those are my top 10 features of Windows Server 2012. The bonus one that I have is, I know it's not in Windows Server 2012, but in Windows 8, the desktop version here, which looks identical really to Windows Server 2012, you've got Client HyperV. So Client HyperV is a Type 1 hypervisor. It's not a Type 2 hypervisor, for example, like VMware Workstation or like Microsoft Virtual PC. It's a Type 1 hypervisor, and it's built in to the Windows 8 operating system. So this just about every desktop or laptop out there that has Windows 8 Pro Edition, you've got client Hyper-V installed. So you could take advantage of server virtualization right on your own desktop. Then you can easily transfer virtual machines from your desktop to your server and back from the server down to your desktop. So it's a great way for developers, for IT pros, to still take advantage of virtualization, maintain virtual machine compatibility between your servers in the data center running Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V, move virtual machines to and fro. It's pretty cool. Now, before we get into questions, just a couple courses I wanted to point out that TrainSignal has. This is actually a brand new course I haven't watched yet that I really want to watch, which is using System Center 2012 to configure and deploy a private cloud. So it goes into Windows Server 2012, Hyper-V, and then it also goes deeply into System Center 2012, and it massages them all together, stirs them all together to create a really cool private cloud. And of course, this will help with Microsoft's new MCSE Cloud certification exam as well. And then my new training is Hyper-V new features. I also have a Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V Essentials. So Essentials is for those who have never been exposed to virtualization before. They've never used Hyper-V before, whereas this new features training is for those who have previously used Windows Server 2008 R2 and are just looking to find out what's new and how to take advantage of these new features. So before we go into questions, let's jump over into my lab real quick, and I just want to see if I can demonstrate some of these features for you. Let's see how the lab works, and you never know about lab environments, whether they're going to work or not. So this is a live lab. This is actually 2 Hyper-V servers. Hopefully you can see the screen. What I have here is Hyper-V Manager running. I've got 2 identical rack servers. I call them Hyper-V1 and Hyper-V2. These are actually the servers I used in my course, to demonstrate all these features. So I've got a virtual machine here, actually a couple virtual machines, but I've got one called Replicate Me. And I just wanted to demonstrate replication with this. So how easy it is to use Hyper-V Replica. Really all you do is go down here. I right-click on the virtual machine. I go down here. I click on Enable Replication. It walks you through a wizard here. So this replication wizard is going to help us configure replication. I want to replicate this virtual machine to host Hyper-V1. Let's pretend that that host is, at another data center. We're going to use, Kerberos authentication, the default. We're just going to take a lot of defaults here. In my course, of course, I go into more depth on, what all these things mean. But in this webinar format, we're just going to kind of breeze through these here. So it shows us where the virtual hard disk is. It gives us the option to create a recovery history. We'll just use the latest recovery point. Our initial replication method, we'll choose to send it all over the network. Of course, we could use feeds. We could manually, copy some files. We could bring virtual machines over on, let's say, a USB drive and load them on the server. We're going to send it all over the network. We're going to start this replication immediately. Here's our summary. I'll click Finish. Oh, no. What happened? Honestly, I tested it right before this, and it worked. The server is not in a state to accept replication. Okay, I don't know why that's happening. But you see, honestly, I did test it right before. This is what always happens with labs and webinars. That's why I had the screenshots for you over there. So, but you see how easy replication is. In fact, let's look on this virtual machine. This virtual machine I actually already have replicated. It's already being replicated right now. And if you look down here at the bottom on the replication tab, we can see that this is the primary virtual machine. Replication is enabled, and the replication health is normal. So here I can execute a planned failover. I can view replication health. I can pause replication. Here we see our replication is enabled. We get to see our statistics of the data that's being transferred across the wide area network to the backup data center, let's say. And if we go over to the other Hyper-V host, here's actually the replica virtual machine. So here's web server 1. We can see this replication type here. It says this is the replica, not the primary. So this is the replicated virtual machine. Currently it's powered off. If I were to right-click on it, go down here to replication, I can test failover. I can remove replication. I can actually execute failover. The problem here with my other replication may be I've got a virtual machine hanging out here from my previous test. So we need to get rid of that virtual machine, delete that. Now let's go over to HyperV 2 here. Let's try to enable replication again. I'm going to take all the defaults here. There we go. All right, solve the problem. I love solving problems live, doing a little troubleshooting here. So now we've got this virtual machine. Replication is enabled. It's being replicated from host to host, from data center to data center. Of course, in my lab, these are actually in the same data center on the same network, so that's why replication appears just instantaneous. But you get the point. You see how easy it is to replicate virtual machines. Let's see, what else can I show you? Migration. So if you wanted to migrate a virtual machine, you can go down here to Move, and this is the live migration or storage migration wizard that it walks you through here. So moving the virtual machine would be a live migration. Moving the virtual machine storage would be a storage live migration. Of course, these are both live because the virtual machine's running. And then it just walks you through the process here. What do you want to do with the virtual machine's files? You want to put them on a single location? What location? What host do you want to send them to? It's really easy. It takes a few seconds. And to the end user using that virtual machine or that web server, there's almost no downtime. I mean, they're not even going to notice maybe a momentary millisecond or two of interruption. Other things I can show you here inside HyperV settings. This is where you go in and live migrations. You configure live migration, enable it, and specify what other hosts can perform live migrations with this host. Exact same thing for storage migrations, but you are limited to just specifying the maximum number of storage migrations. Of course, this is the number that Microsoft says is unlimited here, but the default is 2. Replication configuration, this is where you enable replication for a HyperV host. Really easy to do. Say OK. I didn't go in and answer all the questions. There we go. Say OK, and we enabled replication. So things are really straightforward. That's one of the things I like about Windows Server 2012. Dynamic memory is something else I could show you here. If I go into the settings on this virtual machine, go into the memory configuration. You can see here this virtual machine has dynamic memory enabled. We cannot, actually it does not have dynamic memory enabled, and we can't make that change because this virtual machine is powered on. So I go over to another virtual machine and go into the settings for that virtual machine, memory. Here we can enable dynamic memory. So I can say, well, this virtual machine, it might need a gig of memory to start up, but the minimum RAM is still 512. The maximum RAM, I'll let it go up to 8 gigs. And this is a pretty important virtual machine. So let's set the memory weight. Let's set the memory weight pretty high on this to ensure it has priority for memory over the other virtual machines. We'll say OK, and we just configure dynamic memory. One other thing I was going to show you before we do questions is the extensible virtual switch. So if I go to the virtual switch manager, then into my virtual switch extensions, here you can see the Microsoft Windows filtering platform. These are switch extensions. So these switch extensions are what's added. You can think of them really as drivers to the virtual network, the HyperV virtual switches in the virtual network, to be able to pull information out or even potentially make changes. But primarily it's for monitoring the virtual network, and then other applications that can create virtual firewalls or scan the virtual network for malicious traffic. All right, so that's HyperV Server 2012. I think that's everything I was going to demonstrate for you. Let's go back to our slides here and then take some questions. All right. So, questions. Can you run HyperV off of flash memory or USB like ESXi? You can. I don't see any reason why not. I haven't tried it myself. I actually do have Windows 8 to go, which is a version of Windows 8 on a USB flash drive that I got from TechEd. I can plug it in my laptop. I can boot off of USB, and I can run Windows 8. I don't see any reason I can't run client Hyper-V, and if I can run client Hyper-V, I should be able to run Windows, Server 2012 Hyper-V. Now, granted, it wouldn't a USB flash probably isn't going to have enough space to hold, Windows Server 2012. But maybe if you went down to the free edition or, did a core install or something, certainly possible. I might do a little bit more research and email you after this, because I think personally that would make a great blog post. I'd really like to try that out myself. Good question. Another viewer asked, what's the best way to back up Hyper-V? Is it a good idea to cluster the physical server hosts? And can Hyper-V be clustered? What about replication snapshots too? The best way to back up Hyper-V, I'm sure, like many things, this is debatable to some degree. There's multiple ways to do things in, just about any product today. And the best way to do something is typically up for some debate. Microsoft might say the best way to back up Hyper-V is to use their data protection, solution that they have. But of course, there's also great third-party solutions. For example, I know I've worked with Veeam a lot in their VMware backup product, and they also have a new Hyper-V backup product. So there's a lot of great Hyper-V backup tools out there, is what I'm trying to say. And I would start probably with one of those, backup tools designed just for Hyper-V. Because certainly, just like any physical server backup application, you could run agents inside your virtual machines and still back them up just like you do your other physical servers, but that's not efficient at all. One of the great benefits about virtualization is you can back up just the changes that occur to the virtual disk or the virtual machine disk files, and that's going to cut your backup times tremendously, and then do image level restores. And you're not going to get that by simply using an agent inside a virtual machine. So you can cluster Hyper-V servers like you would when you create a failover cluster, and replication. The new Hyper-V Replica is supported inside clusters, as are snapshots, to my knowledge. I guess I've never tried it inside a cluster, but they are. There's no reason they shouldn't be. So, great questions. If you have more questions, feel free to email me afterwards. There's my email address there on the screen. Let's move on to some other questions. I'm a VCP and MCITP, a virtualization admin. I'm very impressed with Hyper-V 3. I've seen your videos. Keep more videos coming on Hyper-V. Okay, I will certainly do that. It's a great product. I encourage you to keep learning more about it and creating more videos. Another person asked, can quick migration be set up as a backup option for disaster recovery? I think I would use, Replica instead, really. That's what Replica is for, instead of, some sort of like scheduled quick migration. Another person says, I have two EFXi 5.1 hosts, and how would I add Hyper-V to my environment? Well, an interesting thing about Hyper-V when it comes to building a lab and learning about it is, unfortunately today, you cannot run Hyper-V inside of Hyper-V. So I can't create a virtual machine on my Windows 8 laptop with client Hyper-V and then install Windows Server 2012 inside and then enable the Hyper-V role and run another virtual machine. It just doesn't work. However, you can install VMware Workstation on a Windows 8 laptop, install Windows Server 2012 as a virtual machine, and then run Hyper-V and even run a virtual machine inside. So they call that nesting, and that's actually, to me, a great way to learn about Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V is just to do it inside VMware Workstation, which you can get in a 30-day evaluation. Or if you have a Mac, you can use VMware Fusion and run Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V inside Fusion. You also, by the way, I should have mentioned, you said you have two EFXi hosts. you can actually run Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V inside a virtual machine, inside ESXi. And there's blog posts out there. If you search, on Google, you'll find those. If you don't find them, send me an email. Let's see, what other questions do we have? What's the difference between Replica and live migration? Replica is for disaster recovery purposes, so you're replicating an entire virtual machine, including the virtual machine disk file, to another host. And typically you would do it to a host that's off-site, for disaster recovery protection. Live migration, you're moving a running virtual machine from one host to another, most likely, to balance the load. Say one host is really getting maxed out, the performance is getting maxed out, the resources are, running low. So you perform a live migration, move that virtual machine to another host that has more resources, or maybe you need to shut down that host and perform some maintenance or replace it on lease and put in a new host. You could perform a live migration and do all that without having to shut down your physical servers. Let's see, another question. What's the difference between Replica, live migration, and failover clustering? So I talked about Replica and live migration. Failover clustering is for local physical server disaster protection. So let's say I have 2 physical servers. Instead of running 5 virtual machines on one and 5 virtual machines on the other, I put them in a cluster. I still run 5 and 5 on each. But if one of those hosts fails, the other host will take over those virtual machines. Those virtual machines will be brought over to the host that's still alive, that's still running and powered on. Those virtual machines will be restarted, and in a few minutes, those virtual machines will be up and available and performing their applications and services to the end users. While the other host that's dead, you repair it, and then it's brought back online later, and the virtual machines are live migrated back to the original host. So that's the concept with failover clustering if you're not yet familiar with it. Let's see, another question. Is it possible to use an old virtual machine created on a virtual PC or convert it to be used in Hyper-V without losing data that's currently stored on the virtual machine? Yes, you can do that. Probably want to use some sort of conversion tool, like a P2V conversion tool is usually the easiest thing. I haven't personally converted virtual machines in a long time from virtual PC, but I'm sure there is a way to do it. If anything, worst case, you use like a application like Ghost, and you create an image of the virtual machine, and then you put it in a new virtual machine in Hyper-V. But there's got to be a way to do it. Let's see, what other questions do we have? Okay. This is a great one. How do you decide which product is best for your organization for virtualization and cloud? It's a great question. It's also a really hard question. I mean, every company is different, right? Every company, has their own needs and experiences. Maybe you have years of Windows Server experience and you just feel comfortable with Windows Server. So you've already got a bunch of Windows Server. Maybe you have a enterprise license from Microsoft. You've got all these Windows Server licenses. So enabling Hyper-V on those servers is just easy. It just makes sense. And so, for that company, I'd say, well, great. If that's your situation, then go with Hyper-V. If maybe it's the lowest cost thing to do, it's the easiest thing to do, and it's where your experience is. On the other hand, if you're brand new, you've never used virtualization before, I'd encourage you to try out some different products in a little lab or even just on your local desktop or laptop. Learn more about them. See what you feel most comfortable with. Compare the costs. The costs are controversial. Microsoft says they're cheaper. Citrix says they're cheaper. VMware says they're cheaper. But also don't always look at the cost. Don't get stuck on the cost because there's a lot more to anything than just cost. I mean, we know that from buying a car. Sure, you can buy the cheapest car, possible, but that doesn't mean it's the best decision for you. Maybe you want to spend a little bit more, get a little bit higher quality, some nice features in the car, and for that, maybe a different virtualization solution would be right as well. So it's a great question. Feel free to shoot me an email, if you have more specifics. Let's see, moving on. Does the replica exist as a live replica with daily changes being added? Yes, the replication is continuously happening. It's not just a one-time thing. I know I sort of portrayed it as that. It just sends it over and it's done. But it is happening continuously, and you can also specify how often you want the replicated changes to be sent. How does live migration without a SAN work? Is the VM stored on the HyperV local disk? Yes. So if you don't have a SAN, then the HyperV virtual machine is either stored on the local disk of the HyperV server, and the other HyperV host is accessing it through a Windows share, or that virtual machine is stored, let's say, on a Windows file server, and those Windows file servers could be an individual server, or they could be in a cluster, and that's where the virtual machine is. So yeah, it has to be somewhere where both hosts can access it. Someone else said, I heard the domain controller can now be fully virtualized and cloned with Windows 2012 and HyperV 3. I don't know if this feature is available with Windows domain controllers only, or can you? I tell you, this question about domain controllers, go ahead and just email that to me, or I'll try to get your information and get back to you, because I'd like to do a little bit more research on virtualizing domain controllers. I've virtualized my domain controllers for a long time, but so definitely you can virtualize domain controllers, but you're asking about converting them and so forth, and I'm not too sure I want to get into that. Someone asked, can the Cisco Nexus 1000B run on HyperV? Yes, I did see on the Cisco webpage there is a HyperV version of the Cisco Nexus 1000B. In my home lab, to create a cluster, do the servers need to be identical hardware? For the CPUs need to be from the same family. So that's something certainly to keep into account if you're wanting to do something like live migration or clustering or something. That is important. So yes. Let's see, what other questions do we have here? Lots of questions. Is there any reason in moving off vSphere to HyperV if I already have my infrastructure set up? Curious about whether to extend my VMware licensing costs or look for VMware options or look for HyperV options. Great question. This person already has vSphere 5. I love vSphere 5. It's an excellent hypervisor. If you're curious about whether you should move to HyperV, I'd say, learn about it, test it, see what you think. Be interesting to compare your VMware experience to how you do things in HyperV and how, just how well you think it's built, how easy it is to do things, how reliable you feel that it is. Test it out. Might you save some money? Potentially, yeah. But if your company isn't pushing you to save money, then and you're comfortable with VMware and happy, then maybe just stay there and invest your time in something else. Let's see. Can we run a virtual machine on an SMB share? What about performance of the virtual machine? SMB3 is much higher performance, and if you have gig Ethernet or who knows, maybe you have 10 gig Ethernet. There's a lot of performance out there available for these virtual machines, and SMB3 is very high performance. So you can actually run virtual machines off of SMB3 shares. Yes, it's possible, and the performance is good. Now, the follow-up question to that is, what about I/O performance if you use SATA disk that's directly attached to the server? Well, that's a good point. Depending on the types of virtual machines and how many I/Os per second your virtual machines are pushing, you need to make sure that your disk can back it up. So you could create a performance bottleneck by just throwing virtual machines on a local single SATA disk, and then maxing out the capacity of that disk. Let's see. There's some questions here from Twitter. Do virtual machines need to belong to a domain to do live migration? You can create. You can do live migration if virtual or if HyperV hosts are just in a work group, but there's some manual command line stuff you have to do to make it happen. But as far as the virtual machine, no, they don't. It doesn't matter about the virtual machines being in a domain or work group or whatever. Is there a way to do System Center Virtual Machine Manager or any third-party application to do vMotion between different hypervisors? That's a great question. You can't. I've never seen a way to actually do a vMotion or a live migration with the virtual machine running. But like I have used a company called Hotlink. They have a product called Supervisor, and they just released a free edition where if you have to have VMware vCenter already. That's like the big catch. But then from there, if you have Windows Server 2012 hosts, you can actually move virtual machines back and forth, and they're all managed by vCenter. So you can see the virtual machines running in Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V. You can clone virtual machines over there. You can move them to VMware. You can clone those virtual machines from VMware, move them to Hyper-V. You can access the consoles on both of them, all from VMware vCenter. So it does require some money because you have to have VMware vCenter already and vSphere, but Hollow Supervisor, they do have a free edition, and it is useful. But no, it's not vMotion. Let's see what else. Running out of time, just a few minutes left here. Could you talk about some advantages when using System Center Virtual Machine Manager? Train Signal, I should throw out bone to them. They have a great System Center Virtual Machine Manager training course. But the quick and dirty here is, managing Hyper-V hosts individually, if you just have 2 or 3 or maybe 5, doesn't seem like that big a deal. But, think about if you had 10 or 20 or 30 of those hosts. Managing those hosts and all those virtual machines, as you might guess, can get very confusing. And so System Center Virtual Machine Manager is an excellent tool for really bringing everything together, centralized management. So you can have a centralized repository of your template. So you can say, here's a Windows server. I want to deploy it onto this host on this cluster, and in just a few seconds, it'll be there from a template, that you created, a central template. So that's one advantage, a central template library. Another advantage is seeing all your hosts, all your virtual machines, centralized reporting, centralized analysis of what's going on across all the hosts and all the clusters. That's the biggest thing to me that SCVMM will offer you. Let's see, one more question here. Is there a way in Hyper-V 2012 to create virtual machine priority dependency similar to a conventional cluster resource setup? That's a good question. Let me do a little research on that and get back to you. Let's see. Since I didn't answer that one, let's do another one here. Someone says we are running vSphere 5 right now. Where can we find all the features that are in Hyper-V 2012? Tip for you here is that Microsoft has something called Virtual Academy. And of course, I hate to steer you away from any Train Signal products, but we don't have a competing product on this today. And Microsoft Virtual Academy has something called a Hyper-V admin training course for VMware administrators. So you're a VMware admin now, you want to learn about Hyper-V, they have a course exactly for that. So they'll compare what you saw in VMware, the features you used, and what is offered in Hyper-V 2012. So I think that would be a great solution for you, since you said you have vSphere 5 now, you're interested in learning about Hyper-V 2012. That would actually go out and compare the features for you. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. I really appreciate everyone attending. If I didn't answer your question, feel free to email me. I'll try to get to the other questions that I didn't answer. My email address is on the screen there, david@trainsignal.com, or I'm also on Twitter, David M. Davis. I post a lot of virtualization news and how-to articles, so give me a follow if you're on Twitter. Thanks, everyone, for attending.